first out of necessity. It was out of necessity when I grew up in Vermont, but lived in Seattle for a while. When I moved back to Vermont, was looking to come back. I was in a position where I could afford to come back and establish, but I didn't have a job lined up. I didn't have kind of a way to sustain my life once I got here. So I knew that I needed a home that would allow me to kind of earn an income out of it immediately. And so turned to the short-term rental market, started renting out half my home, and loved it. Just really enjoyed the hospitality aspect of it, and have kind of grown and developed into this job, this self-made job and industry where I'm taking care of properties, both long and short-term rentals, managing the customer interaction, the tenant interaction, the landscaping, the cleaning, the maintenance, all of that dirty work has been, I don't know, I've just found it as a natural calling. It's nothing to do with my background or original career path aspirations, but it's just something I've found myself in.
Well, you probably proved the old adage that the only sane people are the people we haven't met yet. I mean that with humor response. So everybody is joining us. You guys probably know this, but my name is Brian Armstrong, the CEO of Keller Williams Vermont, as well as Strongville Real Estate Team at KW Vermont, Strongville Property Management. We have this esteemed and person who provides me a tremendous value on a daily basis, Angela Zaikowski of the Vermont Apartment Owner Association. Strongly encourage if you're visiting us today to actually sign up with the Vermont Apartment Owners Association, be it their forums, their advocacy. I think I've been a client for most of the last 20 years. Some of the best tax deductions you can take is joining, Vermont Apartment Owners Association. We also have Julie Marks here this morning to talk to us about short-term rentals. We encourage everybody to put your questions in the Q&A. And the more interactive you are, the more questions you ask, the more that we can bring value to each and every one of you. And as we were talking to Julie about how she got into this, as a property manager and as a real estate broker of one of the larger firms in the state, this is actually questions that we're getting over and over again. Which towns can you do it in? What are the caveats? What's the legitimacy? So let's maybe start, if I may, with what is going on in Gotham, Burlington, one of my favorite cities. What is going on in Burlington? Do I have to own a 3-unit, live in one Section 8, Airbnb? Can I do it with a duplex I don't live in? Help me out, Julie. What's going on?
Yeah, so Burlington has created this summer, passed in August, has created a set of rules for short-term rental activity, and it's a little complicated. So I'll do my best to try to keep it clear. They have essentially laid out some restrictions on where and how you can run a short-term rental. You may run a short-term rental in your own home, in your primary residence. So either while you are there, if you just have a room or guest suite that you want to rent out while you're on site, you may do that. You may also rent your own home in its entirety when you are not there. So if you spend half the year in another place and your home is vacant for half the year, you can short-term rent it while you are gone, so long as it's claimed as your primary residence. Now you may also, this is one of our victories as an advocate for this industry, is if you are a property owner in Burlington, you live there, and you have an detached accessory dwelling unit, an ADU, on your property, you may also rent that out year round as a short-term rental. This was something that the majority of the council was looking to not allow in the initial version of this ordinance, but we were able to really get the mayor's support to veto that and come back with a more reasonable allowance for short-term rentals in people's ADUs. So that's allowable. And then for offsite owners, so if you are a property owner in Burlington and you don't live in the property, you have very limited options. You can essentially register one short-term rental in your portfolio, and it has to be in a building that has more than one but less than 5 units. And then within that building, you must offset that short-term rental with another rental unit that's available at the inclusionary zoning rental rates, or accept a Section 8 or other type of state or federal voucher. So they've created an opportunity to almost offer this trade-off for a short-term rental and an affordable unit within the same building if the owner is not a resident of that property.
So that is a significant victory, because I know they were looking to, prohibit it altogether. We did have a question: what qualifies as an ADU?
An ADU, I don't have the definition up in front of me, but it does have a definition in zoning. It's an accessory dwelling unit. Typically, there are size requirements. It's X percent of the size of your primary home, and you typically, if you're building it, you need a permit and go through the permit process. Apartment.
I think that we folks who may just not have the answer. I think give or take up to 35% of the total square footage of the property.
That sounds about right, Brian. And there
is,
I think, a state statute that allows them, and then towns have the ability to like further restrict it from that. So it is also town by town to some extent.
We actually had another great question: is this one rental? So let's say hypothetically I have a 3-unit. I don't live in it. 1 unit Section 8, 1 unit short-term rentals, one's run the mill. Could I then buy a second 3 or 4 unit and apply the same algorithm, or is that an answer you would know of, Julie?
The intention of Burlington's ordinance is no. They don't want one person being able to own and operate more than one short-term rental in their city. That's the short answer.
However, if the property is owned by an LLC, then it has a distinct owner, because an LLC is a legal entity. And so my guess is that if your properties were each individually owned by separate LLCs, that would be individual owners.
I definitely think there's an argument for you are the legal expert, not me. But I do know that they have attempted to put language in their ordinance to avoid that loophole. However, I imagine we might see that challenged.
No, great points. The other thing, I was actually having coffee with a friendly competitor of mine from another firm recently, and they actually mentioned that, and this was news to me, Morrisville's adopted some similar, regulations. Could you share with us maybe a little bit about Morrisville, or what other municipalities may be trying to, for lack of a better phrase, throttle this industry?
Morrisville has just taken some recent action, and I apologize for not being fully up to date on the outcome of their latest select board meeting, but I do know that they had a hearing where to discuss the proposal of essentially banning non-owner occupied short-term rentals in certain zones within the town. And then I think also at a certain building size, I think it also had to do with occupancy. And we unfortunately, what we as an organization try to do is establish local chapters throughout the state to monitor local regulation activity, and also kind of lead and spearhead the community involvement and advocacy there. Unfortunately, we don't have a chapter established in the Morrisville-Stowe area yet. So our awareness of what's going on there is just fully reliant on citizen engagement and informing us directly. But we are seeing more and more communities around the state talk about short-term rentals and take very drastically different approaches to it. what we don't like to see is this gut reaction to ban short-term rental activity, especially outside one of our biggest tourist destinations in the state.
Well, I'm having coffee with this individual again Tuesday, and I'm going to compel them to start, the Morrisville chapter. I believe they're a resident there. But Julie, that brings in another interesting, question. We have, I'm sure, property owners as well as real estate agents, property managers. What could we do to better help your organization advocate for our rights as property owners?
Yeah, there's so many things to do. I mean, first of all is getting involved and becoming a member with VSTRA, with the VLA, the Landlord Association. Support the work that these groups are doing to educate and advocate on your behalf to protect your property rights. What the realtor community can really help do for us is educate. We need to educate the community, we need to educate homeowners, and we need to educate our elected officials. There are so many myths or misunderstandings about short-term rentals that I encounter every day that are so basic misunderstandings that I've forgotten that people don't know what I know about this industry, to the level of people not realizing that Airbnb and VRBO are collecting the state 9% tax on every single reservation. Airbnb as a company alone remitted to the state of Vermont $16.5 million last year. That's just Airbnb. And our other intel suggests that it's about a third, 30 or 40% of the overall tax that was collected by the state through the vacation rental industry. So a lot of people are still under the impression that it's the Wild West, it's completely unregulated. The state's not getting anything out of it. And that's just so far from the truth now.
That number I found staggering. That's extremely good information because that is putting a lot of money back in our local economies.
Yep. And in Burlington specifically last year, the city of Burlington received $153,000 from Airbnb alone. And that city only has about 200 short-term rentals, or had 200 short-term rentals in 2021. So it's a huge, it's a huge industry, and that's just the direct benefit to the city. That doesn't obviously include the income that residents have earned, the income that the spending that those residents put back into the community with cleaning, property maintenance, landscaping, furnishing, and upkeeping their properties. And it doesn't include the guest spending of patronizing all of our local businesses.
And Julie, one of the arguments that we hear time and time again is that if short-term rentals are regulated, it's going to open those units back up to the long-term rental market. Do you have any statistics to show whether that's actually true, or if that's actually happening, or do those units just sit vacant?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think we're just starting to see kind of precedents come into the light nowadays. Everywhere around the country, this is all new and happening at the same time. And so everybody is trying to kind of learn by error. I can't say that I've seen any major success stories in terms of replacing short-term rentals with long-term rental units based on policy bans. There are so many reasons why property owners choose to rent short-term instead of long-term, and those reasons are often non-negotiable for them as individuals. And so I guess my short answer would be no, I don't have any information or data that I can point to say this is what has worked. And that's why we don't recommend this approach, because it hasn't been shown to be effective.
And everybody, what I'm about to say is just a hunch. I think you can make an argument that it would free up some units, but the question is it going to be more of a drop in the bucket, more than a drop in the bucket of what is truly needed? One of the questions, Angela, is, have you seen or do you believe that these local ordinances will be challenged? And, if so, what do you think the odds are in Vegas on their success?
I mean, it depends. And we see ordinances challenged sort of sometimes but generally it's with limited success. Like it has to be something that's pretty egregious, pretty outside of any sort of authorizing sort of statutes. With the Burlington approach, there was a charter change request. It went up, it's come back. They're now developing the ordinance. If would have to almost run afoul of something in that underlying legislative authorization. And so it becomes very difficult to challenge some of these ordinances just because there is a long history of allowing regulations of property in the state and around the country.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen in other parts of the country, people have challenged ordinances with varying success. I think it does depend on each situation, case by case. But there are more and more precedents coming online as time goes on. But yeah, in Burlington, there's certainly a lot of questions that we have around the process in which this all came about, and around the process going forward and how it will be enforced and implemented. So it's an issue that we're still engaged in actively, even though this, it's passed, but it is an ordinance, and so it is also in the hands of the elected officials of the time, and can be changed in the future. So,
right.
We also have to look ahead to who the next round of leaders are going to be within the city, and try to demonstrate that the impact of this ordinance may not have the outcome that they are intending, and instead come with some unintended consequences.
Right. And Julie, where do you currently have chapters located around the state?
So we do have a chapter in Burlington. It's led by a fantastic woman, Burlington resident, Deb Lyons. Happy to put anybody in touch with her if you're interested in becoming a part of that community. We have a chapter in Killington. We have a chapter up in the Jay Peak area. We have a chapter in Mad River Valley, and we have a chapter, two other chapters in the southern part of the state, one around Stratton and one around Manchester. And we're always looking for more members and more volunteers. We're a fully volunteer-run organization, so we rely on everybody in the community getting involved and participating.
And so what would it take for somebody to open and maintain a chapter in the state?
It would require becoming a member of VSTRA first, and then we would interview folks to figure out what their interests are, what their commitment is in terms of staying involved and monitoring the situation locally. But we would work with folks directly to kind of interview, onboard, and train them into that position. But it can be a really intensive role if there's a lot of activity going on in your community, but it could also be a very very low involvement role when there's not much going on. So it kind of just depends on what's happening.
Excellent. And so I was just looking up, we had a question about whether or not ADUs in Burlington are registered and inspected. And so Burlington requires short-term rentals to be registered. They do also require rental properties, so longer term rental properties, to be registered and inspected. There are some exclusions from the inspection piece, which relate to owner occupied, sort of single family owner occupied, where rooms are being rented. So I think some of it depends on what the ADU is being used for. If it's being rented or to a long-term tenant, or is in the short-term rental, it would need to be registered and inspected. I think if somebody's living there, but it's not a rental situation, it may not. Like, there's some fuzzy gray areas in there, but I think most of the ADUs in Burlington probably are registered and inspected, just given how they're being used.
Yeah, that's a good point. So to back up a little bit, a short-term rental is a rental for less than 30 days in a row. As soon as you have a renter who's staying longer than 30 days or more, it crosses over into long-term tenancy, and then falls under Vermont landlord tenant law. So in reality, we see this fuzzy boundary and this switch back and forth throughout the year in the single property between long-term and short-term. From running short-term rentals myself, more than half the year where we end up renting to people for a little, a month-long stints. And that's just the way the market is right now. And that's what people want. So that definition in terms of what your activity is really nuanced. And that's something that this ordinance doesn't really capture well, because you can be a short-term rental and a long-term rental in the same year for different amounts of time. And you don't always know going into that year how much of each activity you're going to end up doing. Long-term, all rentals do need to be registered in the city of Burlington. This ordinance did extend that to all short-term rentals, including rooms in your house. And the rate, the cost, the fee for registering is different depending on whether it's a room in your house or it's a whole unit rental. And that does trigger an inspection by the city, which really focuses on fire alarms, fire extinguishers, railings, things like that.
Right. It's a lot of the minimum housing standards, and there's a lot, most of them are safety things.
Yes, and pretty basic and reasonable.
Right.
And you see, like, we hear arguments, that Airbnb or VRBO or any short-term rental owner doesn't have to do what a bed and breakfast does, what a hotel does. Can you share anything about your organization's position on that? In the sense, I can see a little bit of both sides of the argument saying, if somebody's renting out a couple small rentals, they probably should have to comply with greater safety measures. But I can also see it for the person who rents it out maybe a month, a year, that would seem a little over the top.
Yeah, absolutely. There's certainly a practical difference between a short-term rental that operates 365 days a year as a short-term rental versus a property that might be somebody's secondary home that they spend time in throughout the year, or is just they offered occasionally as a rental. I lost my train of thought. Can you repeat your question?
Is we wonder about your organization's stance on, the argument against short-term rentals because they don't have to comply with like small hotel regulations, small bed and breakfast regulations, and it's sort of unfair competition to the bed and breakfast owners, the hotel owners, which I can see a little bit of an angle there.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, because a lot of the opposition, especially in Burlington, originated 4 years ago now, from the B&B hotel industry, claiming unfair competition and an unlevel playing field. And it has obviously since evolved now to opposition from housing advocates. But, what I say to the argument that short-term rentals are like bed and breakfast is that they're not. They are a completely different product. They do not involve food service. They do not involve interaction with your host. They do not involve interaction with other guests. So one of the key differences between an inn and is that and why they have those higher level safety requirements is that you have a lot more people sharing the same property who don't know one another, who aren't familiar or have access to the entire space and could get lost in an emergency situation. We don't see that in whole home rentals. And the other big difference is that short-term rentals in Burlington, actually, this is an important part of the ordinance that we haven't discussed yet, is that short-term rentals are now being taxed an additional 9% for their activity. And the city seems to not want to apply that tax to historical inns or the hotels.
Interesting.
Yep. And I think we had somebody else provide some information that in certain areas they were giving information about Ludlow specifically, that a very high number of those properties that are being used as Airbnbs are second homes. And so the owners of those second homes want the ability to be able to use those homes for their own use. And so they would never come back onto the long-term rental market if Airbnb is restricted.
Right. And there are so many reasons why people won't return to the long-term rental market or enter the long-term rental market if they're not allowed to short-term rent their properties. And second home ownership and personal use is one. Bad experiences is another.
Yeah.
We've also have a lot of unique housing situations now where the property itself just doesn't accommodate long-term living. It might not have a kitchen, or it might not have the storage, or that
Right.
to meet that market demand for long-term living. And that's my situation personally in Burlington. The unit that the city is now not going to let me short-term rent was a unit that my mother built on the property as an extension to a bed and breakfast. It is very difficult to live in this tiny studio without a closet, without a full kitchen, for a long term. It's impossible. We've tried. It doesn't work. It wasn't built for that.
Right. And
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and what kind of statistics do you have, if any, related to consumer, right? Because this is also consumer driven. People clearly want to stay in Airbnbs. They want to stay in these kind of properties when they're on vacation. This is to some extent also being market driven. And what are the consumers now going to do when this is being taken away from them? Going to go somewhere else where it's not regulated, where they can stay in an Airbnb?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, that's why we've seen this become so popular, is because there is a demand for it. And I mean, I don't know about you guys, but this is the way that I prefer to travel. I certainly still stay in hotels and inns too when that's what I need to do. I mean, they have their place, but in terms of a unique experience and a longer vacation or a larger group vacation rentals have just opened up travel to so many people. I mean, and we see that. I mean, it's an inclusion and equity issue too. Large family, multi-generational families are able to travel together now and afford to do so. People can bring their pets when they need to. We've seen that throughout the country. And so yeah, the market that's what people want, and we're just seeing the response to that.
I mean, is there a place for the consumer to get involved in some of these conversations and be giving feedback to some of these municipalities and state folks about, hey, this is how I want to travel, and you're going to take this away from me. I'm going to go somewhere else with my money, my tourism dollars.
Yeah, it's an interesting approach. We certainly demoed that in our fight with Burlington. Our hosts had their guests write letters. We would share guest comments and reviews. We would inform our guests like, hey, I know you love coming here, and we've loved hosting you for the past 3 years, but pretty soon you won't be able to stay here anymore. And unfortunately, that testimony, I'm not sure really landed with our elected officials. And in fact, even my experience testifying as a non-Burlington resident, but a Burlington property owner, was often disregarded in comparison to Burlington residents.
Right.
The people who are voting them in.
Right. And we've seen a similar thing happen over on the long-term rental side with the just cause eviction process and trying to provide a reasonable solution. We had met with much of the same response.
Yeah, it's been a challenge to try to educate some members of the city council on the value and the connectivity of business interests with residential interests.
Absolutely. It's all about balance. Julie, on a probably less, juicy topic, any recommendations or basics that you'd give any one of our guests on short-term management? Because as a property management company, very candidly, we haven't gotten much into the short-term rental because I look at it as potentially quite lucrative, but you got to have a great team. You got to have somebody who's going to check the people in, do the cleaning, which is certainly more intensive than what we generally specialize in, which is more long-term rentals.
Yeah.
Any comments on management strategies and best practices?
Yeah, absolutely. Real high level, first off, though, I love this statistic nationally. One long-term rental requires 1 hour of work per week. One short-term rental requires 8.4 hours of work per week. So if you're getting into the short-term rental industry, don't think you can sit back and just make money. It is work. And if you're not doing the work yourself, you're hiring somebody else to do it, and you're managing all the different players that it takes, because it does take marketing, it takes customer service and management, it takes cleaning, it takes maintenance. And there are different insurance requirements too that you should have if you're in the short-term rental industry rather than the long-term rental. There's, typically landlord insurance doesn't cover short-term rental activity. So that's something to be aware of as well. But I would, and you have a lot of technology, a lot more technology options to integrate into your business plan, whether it's marketing through a platform like Airbnb or Vrbo, marketing through your own website, using a property management service. In Burlington, I don't know of many property management services that do short-term rentals, but often in our ski resort towns, there are several local property management businesses who do vacation rentals for second homeowners, and they take a lot of that work away from the owner. But yeah, it's a job. I currently have I manage 3.5 short-term rentals. I say half because one is only a short-term rental for half the year. And that keeps me very busy.
Well, it's interesting when I raised that question, we did have somebody in Amber. Thank you very much. I didn't see your question until afterwards. Does your, alliance provide additional support? So it sounds like from based what you answer, you do probably provide some information about best practices, ideas, and how to find people to help you with that. Would that be an accurate statement?
Yeah, yes, with an asterisk. Yes, we're getting there. Again, we're a fairly young organization, and our first and foremost goal is advocacy and protection of the industry and your right to be able to rent at all. And as we develop more and establish more resources and more volunteers, we've been able to create those types of resources for our members as well. And we host events. We had our first conference this year, which was really great. I don't know if anybody on the call was there, but and we're having a second conference next year, November 13th and 14th, 2023. And it's a great educational experience to meet new vendors, to learn some best practices. And that's also one of the benefits of finding and creating a local chapter is you get to meet other people in your community who are doing the same thing, and you can often swap advice and share cleaners and, you know, share plumbers and, you know, work together like that.
Right. And I think we have a comment in, you know, again, pointing to, you know, one of the concerns in the industry, and that also translates over into the long-term rental industry as well, is getting, you know, the owners and operators educated, and particularly smaller short-term rental operators. We see that with the long-term rental operators as well, that they aren't always aware of all the rules and regulations. They aren't aware of the insurance requirements. For us, they're not aware of lead paint requirements. Like, there's a whole host of things that create issues when somebody has a problem. And it's, you know, a lot of times it's education, and making sure that owners and operators are following the rules, and, you know, outfits like yours and outfits like the Landlords Association help provide some of those resources for folks.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's, and this is, I think, one of the concerns that our governments have with this industry, is that it's become very easy for just any homeowner to turn their home into a business. And historically, if you are entering into the rental industry, there are processes in place to help you create that safe environment and do those maintenance checks, right? You have those set of requirements, and they're different. The safety standards for a rental building are different than your personal home. And so, yes, it takes a lot of education to make people aware that when you're transforming your home into a rental, there are additional safety measures that you should be taking, not even just for state requirements, but for your own liability and, you know, safety of being a responsible host to the people who are coming on your property. So yeah, there's a lot of education to be done. I know that in Stowe, education around for guests and homeowners around bear interaction is a huge topic right now. You know, we get a lot of folks coming up from the city, vacation in Vermont, and they might be less aware of some of the outdoor etiquette of how we keep critters away.
Yeah.
So
Don't
yeah,
feed them.
there's so many education needs.
Yeah, we had another great question from Steve. Do you know how many short-term rentals are no longer available because of the new ordinance, and what percentage of the total available before the ordinance this represents? I guess, in other words, what percentage of STIR stock is no longer available?
Right. So that's going to be a really interesting question that we hope to answer next year once we can see the effect of this ordinance. Currently, while the ordinance came into effect in August, current operators have until May to close up their operations. So we won't see that reflected in the data until about this time next year, I imagine. I have looked at other towns around the state before and after regulation implementation. I'm thinking most specifically of Woodstock, a much smaller community. They only had about 95 short-term rentals when the town imposed restrictions. And they were similar to Burlington in terms of limiting the number of short-term rentals one could own and in what parts of the city. And now the number of short-term rentals in that community is 75. So they lost 20 short-term rentals. Also in the past 2 years, hard to say without doing further analysis if that's a direct impact from the ordinance or if there's some other factors there.
There's not a lot of other options in Woodstock either. Another great question. Can you tell us or share any more information? And thank you, Anne, for asking. Any more information about getting appropriate insurance for short-term rentals?
Yeah, insurance for short-term rentals is an up-and-coming industry in itself. So it seems like every day there are more and more options on the table, which is great. It's making it much more affordable. The 3 companies that I can recommend off the bat are Proper Insurance, Safely Insurance, and I believe State Farm offers a short-term rental rider policy. Those are three options that most of our members seem to be using.
Right. And I think the thing to remember is there is special insurance required. Your general homeowner's policy isn't going to cover even a short-term rental of your property, and your landlord longer term insurance, rental insurance, is not also probably going to cover your short-term rentals if you're doing them. So
Right.
yeah.
Right. Absolutely. And most of these insurance providers will only insure you if you have put in certain safety measures in place as well. So, it's a good check for yourself and for your guests to make sure that you're reducing that risk of injury and liability.
Angela, any other aspects you think that you run into? Because I know you get a lot of questions on short-term rentals, but any other questions that you can think of that come to mind? And while you're thinking of that, I just realized, Amber, thanks again for for another great question. Is the Alliance focused mainly on monitoring of local, state, and state regulations, or does the Alliance provide additional support to short-term owners for best practices? I think we actually answered that question, and you do. Once again, largest challenger is finding service providers.
Yeah, and yep, we are trying to do all those things. So we're all about advocacy, education, and community. And that community piece is really bringing together all the short-term rental stakeholders in the state and connecting them. And that's hosts with service providers. I think and I tie this to advocacy really a lot, because I think it's a missed piece that our regulators don't see, is how much industry is supported by our short-term rental hosts and visitors. But yes, we are building a community so that people can refer one another to service providers, so that we can bring in vendors in front of your face so that you can know who's out there and who's available. We are currently in the middle of launching a new software platform that will enable direct communication among members. So I'm really excited to roll that out in early December. So stay tuned for that. But that'll be that's just part of what we're doing to increase that benefit to our members.
And one question,
Brian, getting back to your earlier question, when I get questions about short-term rentals, we actually refer them to the Alliance. So
Excellent.
Because while we have many similar issues, they are different types of rentals, and they do have different rules. They have different requirements. There's different processes. And so they're kind of the same, but not really. And so I think following up on a question that was posed, if there's other things that can be advocated for to help with the underlying problem of lack of inventory, I mean, that impacts both the long-term and short-term rental markets. And if we had more inventory in the state, I don't think we'd be having these problems. Perhaps maybe we still would be, but I think one of the impediments is it is so difficult to build in the state. And so even if folks want to build, they can't, or have to go through a very onerous, burdensome permit process that can get tied up for years by neighbors or people who oppose the project. And so some level of permit reform, we hear it a lot, Act 250 reform, local permitting processes to make it easier to get developments built will help. And I think as we see more units come online, we may see an easing of some of these, but probably not, because it's just this mentality of we don't like it, so we're going to keep it out of our city.
Yeah.
Well, I would add to that, I think not only do we have to get involved in what I'm hearing is Act 250 reform, but I think the other thing is California just signed a law into place that if you're developing within a half mile of a major public transit hub, which I know Vermont really doesn't have, that the municipalities cannot require parking spaces as part of the planning. So if everybody, who's listening advocates, because one of the things that drives me crazy about Gotham, I mean, Burlington, is that they'll beat up on landlords and not let them, add additional units. For the record, folks, I love Burlington, born and raised in the area. I think it's a great town. I'm challenged by what's happening currently, as you can see. But they'll say to a landlord, well, you can't add additional units because you don't have parking spaces. Yet we're trying to promote, and I believe in this, more use of public transportation, bikes, stuff like that. So I encourage everybody listening, not only get behind Governor Scott for Act 250 reform, but also get involved in municipalities and encourage the lessening of requirements around parking spaces so that more units can be developed. And one other thought on that California law, they interviewed a developer who does rentals, and he said, hey, I'm going to do some rentals that have no parking for Y price and some rentals that have parking for X price. I think that would open a lot of units if we could get more municipalities to look at it like California is looking at it.
Yeah, definitely. We have some good data coming out of the Mad River Valley actually very recently that demonstrates this disconnect between public perception and expert opinion on what the problems are when it comes to housing supply. We definitely hear a lot of emotional public opinion about short-term rentals being the problem, but our housing experts in the state have repeatedly said the opposite, that short-term rentals are such a tiny, tiny, tiny piece of it that it's not worth the energy to focus all the resources on this. And there's so much more that we could be doing, such as zoning reform, such as public education to reduce the opposition to development that's been so historically strong in this state, and is now something that we need to potentially adjust.
Right. We know we've been underdeveloping. The state does housing needs assessments, and we've been underdeveloping for decades.
Mm-hmm.
And let's be frank, North American van lines were the most moved to state in 2021. And with everything that's happening for climate migration, I see our issue only growing. Yes, we're seeing shifts in the real estate market, but not wild shifts. So yeah, I think it's something we're only going to see more and more of, unfortunately.
And so I'm gonna step out, folks. Thank you for coming. The session is not over. I just have to get to a court hearing. So I am leaving a few minutes early, and we'll leave you in the hands of Brian and Julie. Thank you everybody for attending, and we will get this posted on the Vermont Landlords Association YouTube channel if people want to come back and listen in the future. So thank you.
Good luck. Thank you for all you do. I appreciate you. So one of the questions that actually just popped up, Julie, is, is there any aspect of, I'm going to guess there is, how does fair housing apply to short-term rentals?
In what aspect?
They under, I assume, the same protections as far as no discriminations based on, certain classes. Is there any difference that you're aware of with fair housing regulations as applied to short-term rentals, or would you assume they apply across the board as they would to any rental?
So in terms of discrimination, as far as I'm aware, fair housing regulation in Vermont does not apply to short-term rentals. There might be a caveat there for service animals.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a whole different can of worms. But that's my understanding. As an alliance who's interested in advancing the industry and its credibility as a responsible and professional occupation and place in this economy, we would of course advocate that people rent without discrimination.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Now, with that being said, as we round the final, 6, 7, 8 minutes, I encourage anybody, ask any questions that come to mind. But knowing what you know now, Julie, what 3 things would you recommend to somebody who's either getting into the short-term rental business or wishes to expand their short-term rental business?
Well, I would say 1, check with your local authorities and zoning administrations before you buy or before you plan to get into this, so that you can adjust your business plan accordingly. I would also encourage you to join our professional association. We are the only professional business association for this industry. So getting to know other people who are in the weeds of this, have done it before, or are starting out as well, can be really helpful to and supportive if you're just starting out. Number 3 would be, think about your local impact. I really love how Vermont, you can pretty much get everything you need from your neighbor here. Really consider the impact of this business, where you're supplying your resources, who you're hiring, where you're sending your guests in terms of shopping and dining and activities. I think it's really important, again, to demonstrate how much your business here contributes to other people's businesses in the state.
And I really grew out of the day when you mentioned not only how many taxes are paid, but then made me think about what the local property owners do with that money for our local economy. So I grew out of the day more than I expected. So thank you very much.
Sure.
What's the cost to join, and where should people go to join your organization or get more information about starting a chapter?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're online at VSTRA.org. I think I can maybe pop that in the chat. And the cost to join as a host member is $250 a year. We also have a $25 per month membership plan if that's more achievable. And once you're a member, you can get in touch with us, and we'll talk to you about volunteer opportunities.
Excellent. And to our valued guests, we've got a few minutes left. Any other questions A to Z on the information we're bringing you today, and what can we share with you to bring more value to your time? Well, it seems like we're running out of questions. With that being said, Julie, I can't stress enough. First, looks like we might have one. Hang on just a second. Eric Alden, thank you very much. Just said, nice work, Julie. So with that being said, Julie, I can't stress enough. First, thank you for all you're doing, for the rights of property owners in Vermont. Really, really appreciate it. I'm definitely was pleasantly amazed the amount of revenue you're bringing into our communities. Any final thoughts before we thank everybody for their time today, and hopefully help your organization grow a little bit larger and better advocate for our rights as we balance our economic desires to grow in the community?
I just want to thank everybody for attending this conversation. It's been really great, and it's a really important step in that education and community building. I mean, if whether you're in the industry or considering joining the industry, or you're opposed to it or unsure about it, this is really important to have these conversations and to learn from one another the realities of everybody's situation, what the problems are, so we can all work together to find a balance and find solutions that work for everybody and do the least amount of harm. So yeah, just thank you for being here.
Well, everybody, thank you very much for your time. Again, my name is Brian Armstrong. I'm the CEO of KW Vermont, Strongwill Real Estate Team at KW Vermont, and Strongwill Property Management. Please visit us at allburlingtonhomes.com. And I hope everybody's listening, gets organized, joins into the association, possibly starts a chapter. And let's also do our part on the local level as well as the state level to advocate for our rights as property owners, while also respecting the needs of the entire community with long-term rentals as well. All the best to everybody, and thank you very much for your time. Julie, I look forward to future conversations and hopefully helping you in your organization as well. Take care.
Thanks, Brian. Likewise. Take care.